The two burlap sacks cost Nora Hale $4.20 from the back room of Aram Bedrosian's farm outside Española on an October afternoon in 1932, which was what they cost because Aram was moving to California before winter, and nobody at the sale appeared to believe a sack of small brown bulbs was worth carrying home. Nora paid him before the auctioneer reached the orchard tools. The men standing beside the loading shed had inspected the sacks earlier. One had picked up a corm between two fingers, turned it over, and asked whether they were onions. Aram had said they were not. That had apparently settled the matter for everyone except Nora. There was nothing impressive about the corms themselves. They were dry, brown, papery things, each no larger than the end of a man's thumb, with fine fibers gathering at the base and a pointed crown at the top. In the sack, they looked like something a sensible farmer would sweep off a floor. But Nora had seen what came out of them. She had seen it once in a photograph in a horticultural journal, and twice in a seed catalog printed in Pennsylvania. A low autumn flower, the color of a New Mexico sunset, just after the sun itself had gone. Violet petals opening close to the ground, around 3 red stigmas so bright they looked painted there. Those 3 red threads were the reason she had driven 37 miles to Aram Bedrosian's sale. Aram had brought the crocus corms west with his brother in 1919. Their mother had grown saffron outside Van before the family left Armenia, and Aram had kept a narrow bed of it beside his orchard because some things, he told Nora, were easier to carry in the ground than in memory. His brother had died 6 years earlier. Now Aram's oldest son had work in Fresno, and Aram was going west. The saffron was not. Nora loaded both sacks into the passenger footwell of her Ford truck and drove north with the windows cracked against the smell of dust and dry burlap. Her name was Nora Hale. She was 26 years old and had been running the Hale place for 11 months since her mother died in December of 1931 and left her 42 irrigated acres, a tired apple orchard, 9 acres of alfalfa, a house with an adobe kitchen that held heat well after sunset, and 3 years of property taxes arranged in a stack beneath the flour tin. Her father had been dead since she was 17. Her mother had kept the farm going after that by selling apples, milk, eggs, and every other thing the land could be persuaded to produce. Nora had learned the same habit. She knew which rows froze first in April, which irrigation gate leaked under pressure, which 6 apple trees produced fruit worth selling whole, and which were better sent directly to cider. She knew the farm. What she did not know was how to make 42 acres pay 42 acres worth of taxes when apples were bringing almost nothing. She had begun looking for something else in February, not something that required more land, something that made a small amount of land matter more. The first reference to saffron had been in a hotel supply bulletin from Santa Fe. Imported Spanish saffron, it said, had become inconsistent and expensive. The second was in a pharmaceutical catalog. The third was in a letter Nora received from a spice merchant named Samuel Ortega on San Francisco Street in Santa Fe after she wrote to ask whether anyone in New Mexico bought locally grown saffron. He did not answer her first letter. She sent another. His reply came 17 days later. It was 2 pages long. The second page contained prices. Nora read that page 3 times. Saffron was not valuable because a field produced very much of it. It was valuable because it produced almost none. Each crocus flower carried 3 usable red stigmas. Thousands of flowers had to be picked by hand for a pound of dried saffron, and each stigma had to be separated from the yellow style before drying because buyers paid for red, not weight. It was slow work. It was also work that could be done on land too small to make wheat or cattle particularly interesting. Ortega bought good imported saffron in 1-ounce tins. For clean, properly dried local saffron with strong color and no yellow style mixed through it, he was willing to pay $3.75 per ounce. Good dessert apples that autumn were bringing Nora less than 2 cents per pound. The two things could not be compared directly. She compared them anyway. Aram estimated the sacks held approximately 2,800 mature corms and offsets. Properly divided and replanted, the stand would increase each year. The first crop would be small because transplantation reduced flowering. The second should be better. The third, if the soil remained dry through summer and the drainage was good, should be considerably better. The arithmetic did not promise anything quickly. It did promise enough to keep Nora interested. She planted the corms in 4 narrow beds on the highest acre behind the house, where irrigation water could be controlled rather than endured. She marked the rows with cedar stakes. She used one of her mother's old-school notebooks to record planting depth, spacing, rainfall, and the date of the first frost. She wrote saffron across the cover. The first green shoots came in November. The first flowers did not. Aram had warned her they might not after transplanting. She recorded that too. It was in March that Daniel Mercer came to the North Acequia. He farmed 60 acres beyond Nora's place with his older brother, although most of what Daniel actually did involved keeping water moving where water had agreed not to move. He was 31, tall without appearing lanky, dark-haired, and built through the shoulders from years of shovels, gates, wagon tongues, and the 1,000 jobs for which a farm eventually makes a man responsible. His face was the sort that became more expressive the longer one looked at it. At rest, it seemed serious. When he was amused, the seriousness disappeared all at once. His eyes were hazel, though Nora did not determine this on the first visit because the irrigation gate had broken and there was water running toward the lower apple rows. Daniel had come because the shared wooden headgate had shifted during runoff. If they reset the braces from both sides, he said, they could keep the channel from undercutting the bank. Did she have an hour? She did. They worked knee-deep in cold water until the gate sat square. Daniel was carrying the tools back toward the road when he noticed the 4 cedar-marked beds behind the house. Nothing much was growing in them except narrow green leaves. "What have you got there?" "Saffron crocus." He stopped. "The spice?" "Yes." He looked again at the rows. "That comes from a flower?" "3 threads from each one." Daniel considered this. "That sounds inconvenient." "It is." He nodded as though inconvenience were a property of crops he understood perfectly. Then he went home. He returned the next Wednesday because he had found a better iron strap for the headgate. It took 12 minutes to install. He remained 45. The Wednesday after that, he brought 2 lengths of cedar he said were too crooked for his brother's use, but straight enough for bed markers. The Wednesday after that, he came without cedar. By April, Nora had stopped asking whether something was wrong with the acequia. Daniel had stopped pretending there was. Before we find out whether 2 sacks of brown corms can keep 42 acres of New Mexico land from the tax sale, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. These stories reach people in places the people inside them could never have imagined. And if you enjoy stories about the decisions nobody else understood at first, subscribe. There is a new one every week. The first real flowering came in October of 1933. Nora saw the violet before sunrise. There were 11 flowers open in the eastern bed, their petals still narrowed by cold, each holding 3 red stigmas over a yellow center. She stood beside them longer than necessary. Then she went inside for the picking basket. The next morning there were 37 flowers. 2 days later, there were 94. For 18 days, Nora picked before the sun warmed the petals fully, carried each basket to the kitchen table, and separated the red stigmas with tweezers beneath the south window. Daniel came twice during the harvest and learned the work without being invited to. He was slower than Nora. He was also more patient with broken petals, which did not matter to the saffron and mattered to him anyway. When the flowering finished, Nora had dried just under an ounce, 26 grams. She packed it in 2 glass jars and took them to Samuel Ortega in Santa Fe. Ortega opened the first jar. He smelled it. He rubbed 2 threads between his fingers, dropped them into warm water, and watched the color spread slowly. "Good," he said. That was all. He weighed the saffron again. Nora came home with $3.41 after he deducted the portion containing too much yellow style. She put the money on the kitchen table beside the notebook. $3.41 from less than 1 ounce and 18 mornings of work. The apple orchard had produced considerably more money that autumn. It had also required 40 times the land. That distinction was the point. Nora divided the corms in summer. 2,800 became a little over 4,100 plantable corms and offsets. She expanded the beds from 4 to 7. Ortega agreed in writing to buy up to 8 ounces the following autumn at $3.75 per ounce if the color remained consistent. If Nora could eventually supply 16 ounces a year, he knew a hotel buyer in Albuquerque who had been asking for a dependable domestic source. Nora did not tell anyone at the feed store about the 16 ounces. She told them she was planting flowers. That was enough information to produce opinions. Tom Briggs said he had never heard of a farm being saved by flowers. Mrs. Duran at the dry goods counter said she had cooked with saffron once and could not understand why anyone would pay so much money to make rice yellow. The county agricultural agent came out in August. He examined the beds, asked about drainage, read Ortega's letter, and said specialty crops were difficult to evaluate because there were too few local price records. Then he asked whether Nora would allow him to copy her yield figures after the next harvest. Nora agreed. She took that as encouragement. Daniel did not offer an opinion. He came on Wednesdays. He asked how many corms had divided. He asked whether the first-year flowering percentage matched Aram Bedrosian's estimate. He asked how much labor 1 ounce required and whether labor, rather than land, would eventually become the limiting factor. Those were not questions someone invented while standing beside a fence. They were the questions of someone who had been thinking about the operation when he was somewhere else. Nora found that useful. She also discovered over the summer that Daniel had a habit of pushing his hat back when he was trying to solve a problem and lowering it again when he had reached an answer. She found this less useful. She noticed it anyway. In September, she prepared 2 new beds on the slope above the orchard. Daniel arrived that Wednesday with a cultivator blade he had sharpened for her. "You know," he said, looking over the expanded rows, "most people plant flowers where they can see them from the porch. Most people aren't charging by the ounce." He smiled. The seriousness disappeared from his face. Nora looked back down at the row she was measuring. She measured it twice. The second harvest began on October 6th. It was larger immediately. The eastern bed opened first, then the 4 original beds, then the 2 newer rows, with fewer flowers but stronger stems. For 23 mornings, the kitchen table disappeared beneath violet petals. Nora's fingertips smelled faintly of hay and honey no matter how often she washed them. The final dried yield was 5.2 ounces. Ortega accepted 4.9 at full grade. Payment, $18.38. The remaining fraction Nora kept for comparison testing. 5 ounces was not 16. It was enough to prove the curve. In November, she paid the first of the overdue property taxes. She wrote the payment in the notebook beneath the harvest yield. Then she drew 1 line beneath both. Winter came dry. That was good for the corms and bad for almost everything else. By February, the Acequia committee was already discussing whether spring allocation would be shortened. Nora's saffron needed relatively little water after flowering. Her alfalfa did not. The distinction had begun to matter. Daniel came one Wednesday in March with a newspaper folded under his arm. An article in the business section concerned imported spices and rising shipping costs. He had marked 1 paragraph. Nora read it. "Thought you'd want to see it," he said. She looked at the pencil line beneath the paragraph, then at him. "You read the spice market now?" "Apparently." He said it without smiling. That was funnier. The serious expression lasted another 2 seconds before giving up. Nora folded the newspaper and put it inside the saffron notebook. The spring of 1934 was the year the operation stopped looking experimental. She divided the beds again. 4,000 corms became more than 6,000. She converted part of an old apple block where 5 trees had died and built raised rows to improve drainage. Ortega visited in June. He had never been to the farm before. He stood above the beds, looked over Nora's records, and told her the Albuquerque hotel would take anything above his own 8-ounce requirement if the grade held. Nora asked for the hotel's price, $4.10. She did not react. Ortega noticed anyway. Ask them for $4.25, he said. Why? Because they asked me for local before I offered it. Nora asked for $4.25. They agreed to $4.20. She wrote that down too. We're halfway through Nora's story, and I want to know something. Have you ever seen a saffron crocus growing? The flower is small enough to miss if you're walking quickly, and the part people pay for is smaller still. Tell us below. And if you haven't subscribed, this is a good place to do it. The next part is where the numbers stop being small. The October harvest opened under frost. Nora covered the newest beds at night with old muslin sheets and removed them before dawn. On the 4th morning, Daniel found her carrying 2 baskets toward the house and took one without asking. By then, he no longer asked whether she needed help. She no longer told him she did not. They worked at the kitchen table until noon. At one point, Daniel lifted a stigma with the tweezers and looked at it against the window. Hard to believe that's the expensive part. It isn't expensive because it's large. He looked at her. No, he said. I suppose it isn't. She looked back at the tray. Neither of them said anything else. The harvest produced 13.7 ounces of full-grade saffron. Ortega took 8. The Albuquerque hotel took 5.7. Total saffron revenue for the season came to $54.24. The apples brought 49. For the first time, 1 acre of Nora's farm had earned more than the orchard. But the letter that changed the scale of the operation arrived in January of 1935. The envelope came from Chicago. Nora assumed at first it concerned a seed catalog. It did not. A spice wholesaler named Leon Weiss had eaten dinner at the Albuquerque Hotel in December and asked the chef where he was buying his saffron. The chef gave him Ortega's name. Ortega gave him Nora's. Weiss had spent 11 years importing saffron through New York. He had dealt with interrupted shipments, adulterated lots, inconsistent moisture, and wholesalers who improved their margins with things that were not saffron. He wanted an American grower whose production he could inspect from the field onward. He wanted to come to New Mexico in April. He arrived on April 18th in a black Packard with Illinois plates and shoes that acquired New Mexico dust within 6 minutes. He did not appear to mind. He walked every bed. He pulled 1 corm himself and inspected the daughter corms at the base. He asked Nora about flowering percentages. He asked about drying temperatures. He asked whether she had compared color strength after 3 months of storage with color strength immediately after curing. She had. She brought the notebook. Weiss read the figures. He asked whether the sample still existed. They did. She brought those too. He spent 20 minutes with the jars. Then he asked to see the drying room. Nora took him to the adobe kitchen. He looked at the south window, the drying screens, the labeled jars, and the thermometer mounted beside the stove. He asked 3 more questions. Nora answered all 3. At last, he put his hat on the table. I'll buy everything above Ortega's commitment. She waited. Up to 2 pounds a year to begin. That was 32 ounces. Price? $4.60 an ounce for grade 1, $4.20 for grade 2, 3-year term. He also wanted an option on the daughter corms, not all of them, $1,000 each summer for 2 years, provided Nora retained enough planting stock to protect her own production. He would pay 12 cents per mature corm, $120 per year. Nora kept her face still. Weiss apparently approved of this because he kept talking. If annual Grade 1 production passed 24 ounces, he would add a 10% volume premium. Payment 30 days after inspection. Nora looked at the contract draft. "I'll give you an answer Monday." Weiss glanced at her. "Most growers say yes first." "I haven't read it yet." He nodded once. "Monday then." That Sunday, Nora sat at the kitchen table with a saffron notebook, 3 sharpened pencils, the property tax receipts, and every yield figure since 1932. She calculated flower count per corm, Grade 1 recovery, labor hours, expansion acreage, corm multiplication, Ortega's 8 ounces, the Albuquerque Hotel's allocation, Weiss's balance. Then she calculated the sale of daughter corms. She ran the numbers once, then again. Then with yields 15% below expectation. Then with one bad frost. The answer changed. The conclusion did not. Under the conservative case, the saffron could pay the remaining taxes, replace the failing roof, and finance another acre without borrowing. Under the expected case, it could do considerably more. Her mother had never cleared $100 from the orchard in a year. Nora closed the notebook. On Monday, she sent Weiss a telegram. She would accept with 3 changes. Payment in 15 days rather than 30. The volume premium would apply to all Grade 1 ounces once the threshold was reached, not merely the ounces above it, and the corm option would be reviewed annually because planting stock had value beyond the first 2 years. Weiss answered the next afternoon. He accepted the first 2. He proposed a fixed 15-cent price on year 3 corms instead of annual review. Nora accepted that. The speed with which he had agreed to 15 days made her think she should have asked for 10. She recorded this lesson in the margin. Daniel came Wednesday. He arrived with no tool, newspaper, cedar stake, replacement hinge, irrigation problem, or other object that could plausibly explain the visit. Nora let him in. The contract was on the kitchen table. "The Chicago man?" "Yes." Daniel read the first page, then the second, then the corm provision. He looked at her. $120 for things you're digging up anyway. Things I can grow more of. That's worse. Better. For him, worse. She smiled. He read the volume clause. "You changed this?" "Yes." "Did he argue?" "Not much." Daniel pushed his hat back. Nora watched him solve whatever arithmetic was taking place behind his eyes. Then she opened the property map. The Trujillo parcel. His hand stopped. It lay east of Nora's place. 26 acres, mostly neglected orchard, 5 acres of well-drained upper bench, and its own legal share of the acequia. The Trujillo brothers had moved to Arizona the previous winter. The bank wanted $380. Daniel looked from the map to Nora. "You want to buy it?" "I want the upper bench." "You'd be buying 26 acres to get 5. I'd be buying 26 acres with water to get 5. He considered this. She pushed the notebook toward him. The first full year of the Weiss contract covers the down payment under the expected case. And under the bad frost case? 22 months. He turned the page. In the orchard? Some of it comes out. The best trees stay. Daniel was quiet. He had been coming on Wednesdays for 2 years. Nora had learned that his silences were not empty. Some were arithmetic, some were judgment. A few lately were something else. This one lasted long enough that she stopped pretending not to know which kind it was. Finally, he set the notebook down. Nora. She waited. He looked at the contract, the map, the notebook, and then at her. I have spent 2 years inventing reasons to come through your north gate. Some of them were poor reasons. The cedar was useful. It was crooked. It was free. She waited. He laughed once and looked down at the table. Then the seriousness returned. I don't want to invent another one. She said nothing. I want to come because this is where you are. He paused. And if you'll have me, I want to be part of what you're building. Not because I think it needs me. His hand moved toward the map but stopped before touching it. Because I think I do. Nora looked at him, at the contract, at the pencil mark he had made in the newspaper a year earlier, at 2 years of Wednesdays. You could have saved a considerable amount of cedar, she said. For a second, Daniel looked uncertain. Then she put her hand over his. The seriousness vanished. They were married in November of 1935 in a small church in Espanola, with Nora's saffron beds dormant under cold soil, and most of the county aware by then that the flowers behind the Hale house were no longer a hobby. Nora wore a cream dress her mother had sewn for another occasion and never used. Daniel stood at the front of the church with his hands folded and his hat nowhere in sight, which Nora privately considered evidence that the occasion had achieved the seriousness he thought it deserved. They said their vows plainly. Neither added anything. Neither needed to. Nora bought the Trujillo parcel the following February. 26 acres, 5 acres of upper bench, a separate water share. She recorded the deed number on a fresh page in the saffron notebook and underlined it twice. The 1936 harvest produced 21 ounces of grade 1 saffron and 3 of grade 2. The quorum contract with Weiss added $120. The Albuquerque Hotel increased its allocation. Ortega kept his original 8 ounces and complained only that Chicago was making Nora difficult to afford. She told him he had been the first person to answer her letter. He told her that had apparently been an expensive decision. In 1937, the saffron beds covered almost 3 acres. Nora hired 2 women from Espanola for the peak harvest mornings. She paid them by the hour, not by weight, because broken flowers did not reduce the value of the stigmas, and she had no interest in paying people to rush. Daniel rebuilt the drying racks. He did not redesign Nora's system. He asked what she wanted the racks to do and built that. Their daughter Isabel was born in June of 1938. Their son Thomas followed in 1940. By then, Wednesday had ceased to mean anything particular because Daniel lived in the house. Nora occasionally missed the absurdity of the old arrangement. She did not miss the waiting. On an October morning in 1941, she was standing in the upper Trujillo field before sunrise with a picking basket on her arm and the saffron notebook tucked under it. The flowers were open across the rows, thousands of them, violet against brown earth, low enough that the field appeared from a distance to have caught the color of the sky. Isabel, 3 years old, followed behind Nora carrying a basket with nothing in it because Nora had told her she could help and 3-year-old assistants required equipment. Thomas sat with Daniel at the edge of the field, wrapped in a blanket and entirely uninterested in saffron. Daniel had a broken drying screen across his knees and was replacing the mesh before breakfast. He looked up. Nora raised one hand. He raised his. The workers were beginning at the far rows. Ortega's jars waited in the pantry. Vies's shipping tins were stacked beside them. The county tax notices, when they came now, were paid before Nora placed them beneath the flour tin. She had stopped using the original school notebook 2 years earlier because there were no blank pages left. It remained on the shelf. Saffron was still written across the cover in her handwriting from 1932. Nora looked over the field and remembered 2 burlap sacks in the back room of Aram Bedrosian's farm. $4.20. Brown corms nobody wanted to carry home. A man asking whether they were onions. She had not known that afternoon exactly what the farm would become. That part had never been calculable. She had known something smaller. Imported saffron was expensive. Local buyers wanted a dependable source. The crop required labor more than acreage. The corms multiplied. Her land had drainage. $4.20 purchased enough material to test whether those facts belonged together. Everything after that had been another test. A first ounce, 5 ounces, a hotel, a wholesaler, another field, two more workers, a house where Daniel's hat now hung beside the kitchen door every day instead of on Wednesdays. People later described Nora's purchase as lucky. She never argued with them. Luck was shorter to explain. The longer version involved two unanswered letters: soil drainage, drying temperatures, rejected yellow style, frost cloth, contracts read twice, and arithmetic run under assumptions pessimistic enough to be useful. It involved buying something before there was agreement about its value. Daniel crossed the rows toward her. He stopped beside the basket and looked over the field. "How does it look?" Nora opened the notebook to that morning's page. The first 4 rows were slightly ahead of projection. The western bed was slightly behind. The temperature had remained 2 degrees above the frost threshold. She closed the notebook. "Close enough to what I calculated." Daniel looked at her. "That sounds disappointing." "It isn't. If you've stayed with Nora this far, tell us below. What is something you once recognized the value of before the people around you did? Sometimes the most important decisions make sense first to one person and only later to everyone else. Subscribe if you'd like another story next week. Daniel took the full basket from her and handed her the empty one. Isabel was kneeling 2 rows away, examining a flower with the solemn concentration children reserve for things adults have told them not to crush. The sun had begun to reach the upper field. As it did, the violet opened wider. 3 red threads appeared at the center of every flower, small enough to miss, valuable enough that Nora had learned 9 years earlier to look closely.